Okay, welcome to Matilda Education's In Conversation discussions that we're having with all of my fantastic co-authors for the Good Humanities series. That's the year 7, 8 and 9 textbooks. Today, our first one, I'm very excited to introduce to you Al Fricker, who is a Indigenous man and a PhD student at RMIT.
Charles Darwin Uni. I work at RMIT and I study at Charles Darwin University.
Right. So, look, we could speak for hours, but I'm going to try and keep it as focused as I can. If you could firstly tell me about your PhD and how that connects with Indigenous education.
Thank you. So my PhD is part of a larger ARC grant that was awarded a few years ago. Look at the impact of AFL football in a remote Aboriginal community. And I was picked up as a PhD candidate as part of that project, looking at the interface between sport, education and culture for the kids at the Papunya school, which is where we were located. And what global research suggests is that for a child to have access to formal education, to culture and to sport, allows them to achieve more holistically and academically than students that are missing one or more of those components. So my research involved going to the school and working in the school for a month and taking extensive field notes to examine how the students were navigating the interface between those three aspects. As part of that analysis, I examined aspects around content that was being provided to them in the school, the pedagogical processes that the teachers were employing, how the place and space was structured and designed, and how that impacted student movement and student experiences of education, and also community engagement. So how often we were getting people from the community to come into the classroom and provide their support as well. Now that essentially links to education in a broader sense in Australia, because what we have is an education system that has been essentially picked up and dropped into Australia from Industrial Revolution Europe. And so it is an education system that has been designed specifically for the benefit of students who are not Indigenous. And so my research seeks to examine how we can go about decolonising these places and decolonising these structures around content, pedagogy, place and space and community engagement to better support Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students, but also to better support all students regardless of their cultural backgrounds.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that. I was just doing another little video criticising the education. So I think that all students are done a disservice by the fact that our education system was essentially designed to pump out industrial workers. How can an Indigenous perspective on pedagogy improve teaching practice? So I know that as part of your work, you're able to draw out the difference between Indigenous pedagogy and, I guess, the colonised curriculum pedagogy that we see in the state and federal curricula at the moment.
Yeah, so I seek to make a difference between sort of curriculum and pedagogy in this context, because curriculum, as I applied in my research, is a real focus on content. And that is a conversation that we need to have around, well, whose history or whose content is being prioritised when it comes to the curriculum. And at the moment, what we have almost universally is a real focus on Eurocentric content, individuals, ideas, movements. When it comes to pedagogy, my research examines that in terms of the information transmission, the actual act of learning. And I think when it comes to pedagogy, what we know is that the more diverse the pedagogy that we employ in a classroom is, the more it benefits a diverse student body. Regardless of the cultural homogeneity that they may actually have, they're still a group of unique learners. And so when I examine Indigenous pedagogies, what I'm seeking to do is examine the pedagogical processes that were actually occurring in Australia and the continent prior to colonisation, and also more contemporary Indigenous pedagogies that have been adjusted and modified to suit a different temporal context in terms of where we are today. Now, what we know is that societies cannot sustain themselves if they don't know how to educate their young people. If they're not able to do that effectively, societies will tend to roll on and then start to sort of fall apart. And so what I seek to do is engage with the different pedagogical processes which were happening and have been happening in this place for tens of thousands of years. And I would think after tens of thousands of years, we could be pretty comfortable in saying they're tried, true, and tested processes moving forward. And then examine how these pedagogical processes can be applied in the contemporary context of today's Australian classroom. Now, one of the key things about Indigenous pedagogies is their holistic nature. There's not a particular pedagogy that fits a particular discipline or a particular activity or particular content. It's a far more holistic outlook. So we're not only looking to engage with content for their particular academic purposes, but we're also seeking to engage the whole child as well. Now, one of the key differences between Indigenous and non-Indigenous pedagogies is connection to land and to country. So what we see in many non-Indigenous contexts is this Eurocentric idea that the best way to teach a child is to separate them from everything else, from distractions, from their peers, from other influences that may impact how they engage with the content so that they can have their undivided focus. Now, this is very much an old school way of teaching where we've got rows and a blackboard and chalk and, people hitting people with rulers and all that sort of stuff.
Oh, Al, that plays in exactly to the stuff I'm constantly telling students how, school looks so much like prison. We have bells telling us, we line up outside rooms, you expect to be getting frisked before you go in. Yeah, right.
And Foucault wrote about that in Discipline and Punish. He talks about how prisons are very, very similar to other state institutions that seek to control the bodies of the individuals. Schools are a place, hospitals, army barracks, anywhere that there is essentially a restriction of movement, an uneven gaze, and where the institution seeks to create self-regulating, docile bodies. And you're spot on about school. School is absolutely no different from that. And so when we start to think about pedagogies and what they could look like without the colonial construct of school, that opens up a whole range of different opportunities to engage with our learning and the things that we're engaging with. So I look at things like how we communicate in class, so around ideas around how we yarn. Like I said before, learning on country and what that looks like and what that feels like. The idea that we separate students based on age is a very recent idea and very much Eurocentric, because what we know is that before that, the little kids and the older kids would all be mixing together at various points. They might separate for particular things and then come back again. And so it was far more fluid and dynamic. And we also,
there's such a huge benefit to doing that. I know from, we have, a lot of schools have like a buddy program where they put the grade 6s with the preps, or they put the year 12s with the year 7s. And what I've noticed is that the naughtiest of the older kids behave so much better when they are trying to model their behavior for the younger students. It's surprising that we don't cash in on that more. Like when I had a primary classroom, put in the year 6s with the preps, these kids who are normally complete rat bags were just like, oh, I can't be a rat bag around a 5-year-old.
No, you're right. And I think the interesting thing is that we look at that peer-to-peer aspect. But one of the key things that we also need to consider is actually how we involve older Australians and older people. So it is very, very common, even today in Indigenous communities, where we get a lot of knowledge being shared and being taught by grandparents or great-grandparents to very young children and to everybody in between as well. And I think it seems quite odd that we have these schools where you have a teacher that could be between the age of, say, early 20s all the way up to sort of mid 50s or 60 just before retirement, and nothing beyond that. And I think that when we start considering our pedagogy, we also need to consider who we're engaging as part of the community within that aspect. And what we know from the research is that schools that have really solid community partnerships and really high engagement with their local communities, the kids do a lot better, holistically as well as academically.
I can think of a number of student teachers that I've had. I'm thinking, yeah, you probably need some more life experience before you can be offered much. You're right, actually. That's interesting to think that, you know, when people reach the age when they've got so much wisdom, they're basically shuffled out of the education system completely. I want to move on to curriculum content now. I'd be interested to know, how do you obviously know a little bit about the history of how Westerners have been taught about Indigenous culture. How has the content of what people have been taught at school about Indigenous culture changed? I think I hark back to like 4 years ago when I was teaching Year 7 history, and in the published textbook, it said Indigenous people were all hunter-gatherers. So after the whole, you know, and you probably knew about this way before the Dark Emu revolution, but you know, I was only enlightened about that last year, and I'm supposed to be a history teacher myself.
Oh, look, this is a real challenge, and this is also a focus of my research as well. I went through school as an Aboriginal student, and can still remember vividly having history teachers telling me that Captain Cook discovered Australia, and sort of raising my hand ever so gingerly and saying, well, that's all very well and good, but what about the people who were already here and had been here for tens of thousands of years? Surely they would have been the discoverers of Australia, and then, you know, being told to hush up. Now, when we think about the Australian curriculum, what we need to be clear about is the context, the historical context of how the curriculum has been constructed. Now, back in 1968, an Australian anthropologist by the name of William Stanner wrote delivered a lecture, and then it was published as a short piece, an essay called Beyond the Dreaming. And in it, what he did was he went through and did an audit of a whole bunch of Australian history books, and discovered that any mention of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people had only been included as an afterthought or as a real sort of cursory nod towards. There was no great depth of engagement with that. And what he theorised was that because Australia federated without a war of independence or a civil war or a particular event that could create a national identity, one had to be manufactured. And of course, the dominant cultural idea and ideology at the time was Australia being a white continent. So to do that, what the nation makers and the historians at the time did was they wrote out anybody who wasn't white. This included, of course, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, but it also included Chinese migrants, South Sea Islander slaves, and Afghani cameleers who used to run the trade routes through the central deserts. Because they were not white, they weren't included as part of the national colonial history of Australia. As we fast forward several decades or century to today, what we have is an education curriculum that is still very much largely shaped by what he coined as being the Great Australian Silence. And so we still have huge areas within the Australian curriculum which have very large blind spots which prevent Indigenous content from being included. Excuse me. One of these is, interestingly, Year 7, as you mentioned earlier, the Year 7 history curriculum. What we have here is this idea that there's an in-depth study for ancient Australia. Now, the challenge we have here is that ancient Australia is then positioned within the curriculum alongside ancient Egypt, ancient Rome, Greece, India, and China. And when we start making comparisons, what we have here is an Indigenous history unit being put next to other sort of ancient history units of what are considered to be dead civilizations. When the reality is that much of what is taught in that Year 7 history unit for ancient Australia is still currently practiced today by living, breathing people, because it is the longest and oldest continuing culture in the world. So already we see issues in the Australian curriculum where it's being positioned very poorly, and being positioned as something from the past, something that has happened, but not something that is continuing to happen. The next time we hit the history curriculum is in year 9, and that's when we start to examine Indigenous history through the civil rights movement. And here we have some significant issues around the types of language that's used. Things like the struggle, the idea that at once Aboriginal people were being discriminated against, but then we had civil rights and now everything's fine. And so what it does is it really plays down the challenges, the issues, the violence, and of course the ongoing issues which are as a direct result of this continuing colonisation process. When we explore further beyond the history curriculum, we have Aboriginal histories and culture, and Torres Strait Islander histories and cultures as a cross-curriculum priority. But the challenge there is that is not prescriptive in any way, shape or form. It's designed and has been marketed as something where teachers should engage with, along with the other cross-curriculum priorities, and insert them wherever they possibly can. But because we have the Great Australian Silence, which has shaped our knowledge of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, including and in addition to anxieties around not wanting to get it wrong or being considered to be racist or in some very isolated cases not seeing the value in it, there's a lot of teachers who practice a lot of anxious hand-wringing without any activity or action in that space. So this is very much a focus of state government policy in Victoria with the Wurrung Plan, but also the cultural awareness programs which are being rolled out by the department as well to try and address these issues with the curriculum.
Nice. I just Matilda's coming for my coffee, so I'm interested to know. I personally did most of my work for this series on the 7 and 8 books, and the work that you did on the Australian section of the Year 7 book was really, really impressive, and I learned a lot. How did you get involved in the Good Humanities series? And if you can remember 2 questions at once, I'm interested to know what you think of existing history texts and why you got involved in this one, and if you think that there's been some movement towards a progression there.
Look, in terms of getting involved with Matilda, it was quite serendipitous, actually. It was just a random phone call from a friend of a friend who said, listen, I've got a friend who works at this publishing company. They've got a book. They really want to be confident in being able to put it out to market, to know that it's not going to be perpetuating the same old stuff, but they're not really sure what to do. You know a little bit about this. What do you reckon? And I sort of said, hey, look, I'm up for this. And so that's sort of how I got involved. In terms of, generally speaking, the books, I think, again, based on that idea of the Great Australian Silence, we've had a lot of mythology that has been perpetuated around Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And as you mentioned earlier, this idea around hunter-gatherers, nomads, Stone Age, simple, violent. These are all racist tropes which have been used as a way of justifying the dispossession of land and the dispossession of culture for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people for over a century. Well, I'd say actually for 2 centuries. And so my role as an academic is not only to teach beginning teachers in initial teacher education, which is what I do, and also to produce research, which realistically is only going to be read by other academics. But what I want to do is I want to actually have a practical outlet. I want to be able to work with teachers, work with the producers of textbooks, to support them in being able to change that narrative and challenge some of those pre-existing misconceptions. So what we have with the Matilda book is the first draft that I read over, and I certainly don't want to cast aspersions upon any of the authors because they work very, very hard and do a wonderful job. But one of the first comments I made towards Matilda was, you've obviously got a non-Indigenous person to write this, haven't you? And they looked at me and nodded and said, how can you tell? And then when I started to sort of mark up the copy and say, right, well, you can't say this, you can't say that, that's wrong, this is incorrect, have you thought of that? I could see the light bulbs go off and they go, oh, okay, we can see that now. Now, of course, as you mentioned earlier, dark emu has been a huge, huge impact in this space, because it has most certainly brought to the national consciousness a revision of Australian understandings of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And I think that if you haven't read this book, that is most certainly on my top 3 reads to engage with if you want to read this.
Or if you're lazy like me, Young Dark Emu, which is I'm not going to say, it's a shorter version of it, which I think still contains a lot of the important messages. I watched that, and all of the TED Talks I could get my hands on from Bruce.
Definitely.
Yeah, mind-blowing. I think after reading that and watching some of his talks, felt like, and this is another question I want to ask you, I felt like a bit of a fraud, I guess teaching what is classified in the curriculum as an ancient culture, and yet, as you say, it's still continuing. I guess it was me as the person teaching that as kind of history and current events. I probably should have gone out and educated myself a bit more than just reading the compulsory textbook that was, thrown on my desk. And so my question there is, and this is something that comes up quite a lot, it's come up in the history teachers conferences over the last few years. How can non-Indigenous teachers begin to feel comfortable about teaching Indigenous material?
Look, I think that's a really good question. And I think you've definitely hit the nail on the head there in terms of getting educated. So it's about engaging with the growing body of literature which is available for teachers who want to engage with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander history. I would, however, sort of comment that maybe comfort is not what we're seeking to achieve here, because what we know is the process of decolonisation is actually something that is very, very uncomfortable. When an individual has to step up and say, you know what, I acknowledge the fact that I have a lot of privilege here and that my privilege actively disadvantages others, it is actually quite an uncomfortable process to step away from that privilege or start to reimagine that as an opportunity. Sorry, someone's calling me. Let me try it again.
You're a popular guy, Al. What can I say?
Oh, look, it's so annoying because I've got about 4 or 5 different things on at the go. I've got Skype, I've got Zoom, I've got Teams, I've got Collaborate, I've got, everybody wants to contact me for different things. I've lost my train of thought. What was the question again?
You were saying that my question was, how should non-Indigenous teachers feel comfortable? And you made the excellent point, which threw into the question itself into disarray, that decolonising education is not a comfortable pursuit.
Yeah, so in terms of feeling comfortable about content, taking that time to get educated is a really important aspect, because there's a wealth of resources out there. We've got Dark Emu, which is a fantastic book. There's a growing number of websites and community groups and land councils who have education officers. There's contacts you can get through the Department of Education as well if you're at a public school. And I know that the Catholic school system have an Indigenous education body within their system as well, which you can access.
I know that my sector, the independent sector, doesn't have a dedicated person for it, because I've been trying to reach out. But even in local councils, you can find people. I want to put a shout out to SBS First Australians as well. That's amazing.
That's a great resource too, certainly. When it comes to the discomfort, though, that is where we have to examine our own privilege, be prepared to let go of that privilege and use that to support those who are being oppressed at the same time. And that is an uncomfortable experience. Now, in terms of how we go about that, this is where the concept of browning becomes really important. Now, this idea of browning comes from North America, and it was initially focused on how curricula in the States could incorporate more African American or Black content within their formats. But this has very much been co-opted and explored through the lens of Native American research and content as well. And I use that in my research to start to analyse and engage with the Australian curriculum. So, well, Browning actually is a really lovely term here, because we also have the colour divide between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, as it's been sort of traditionally positioned. And so what we need to consider is, when we are teaching our content, how we centre Indigenous content through, it might be the subject material, it might be the authors, it might be the literature that we're engaging with, it might be the people that we're inviting into the school to speak. You know, that all provides content. And that is a key part of being able to shape our classrooms to be a place where we actually add value onto the students' education. And the way that I describe it to my student teachers is saying, kids are going to get Anzac Day beyond the classroom. They're going to get Australia Day beyond the classroom. They're going to get Remembrance Day. They're going to get, all of these days which are very much buying into that colonial narrative. But what they're going to struggle to get outside the classroom is Reconciliation Week, or NAIDOC Week, or Sorry Day, or the Day of Mourning, or Invasion Day, if we want to explore that idea around Australia Day as well. And so, it's a fairly glib remark, but I often sort of comment that we can create a classroom that is an oasis of brown and a desert of white.
Nice.
And that's how we add value and allow them to gain those critical thinking skills, so that when they leave school, when they leave the classroom, they can engage with the national conversation in a meaningful way.
I just want to go back to, you were talking about Indigenous pedagogy, and something in an earlier conversation you said to me about how traditionally people would specialize in certain areas of education, and you would only be given be exposed to educational experiences when you were mature enough or whatever. My own edition, my own work that I've done for the book was to include a developmental progression in the book, so students do activities that get more and more difficult as they go through. I'm wondering if you think there's actually a parallel there, or that's just me hoping there is.
Oh, look, undoubtedly. When we start to examine a lot of the sort of constructivist ideas of Eurocentric pedagogy, what we start to see is huge similarities between Indigenous pedagogies and Eurocentric pedagogies. And most certainly, there is always going to be a developmental continuum that is going to be underpinned by ideas from Vygotsky, where we've got a zone of proximal development and scaffolding, we look after them. In Indigenous contexts, we have an added layer of this idea of restricted education and restricted knowledge, where knowledge that you're only actually allowed to access, it could be split around sex and gender. So this idea of secret men's business, secret women's business, and they don't mix. But there's also particular knowledge that is restricted around your age, your maturity, and also your personality. Are you a good person, or are you selfish and self-centered? And that will determine whether or not you get access to that. And what that essentially is designed to do is to ensure that those people who have those positions of power within the communities are the right kind of people who will exercise that for the benefit of everybody. And even though we have these restricted knowledges, what we also know is that universally across all of the different communities, men and women were represented equally in the power structures and in the decision-making structures in the communities. So there wasn't one group that would sort of monopolize a particular knowledge and then use that to gain their own self. And so that has sort of shaped a lot of how many Indigenous people learn is this idea that rather than being arbitrarily thrown through, all right, you've grown up another year, you're in the next grade, you get the next lot of, there's a lot of sort of self-paced aspects to that as well, which also fits into that pedagogical, sort of the constructivist pedagogical structures. Beyond that, though, we also have phenomena where we have a lot of peer-to-peer learning with same-age children. We have a lot of peer-to-peer learning with slightly older children, and of course, peer-to-peer with even older children yet again, which harks back to that sort of buddy system that you spoke about. And with the pedagogy as well, there's also often a lot of observation. So An example might be that there's a group of men who are creating, they're making a scar tree because they're creating a bark canoe. You'll have young children hanging around who won't actually be partaking directly in the activity, but they will be present. You'll have slightly older kids that'll have a go at little bits and pieces. You'll have the older ones again, and then you might have the elders sitting off to the side around the nice warm fire who might occasionally say a few words to avoid them from accidentally cracking the bark and having to throw it away. But what that means is that through this immersion and almost through osmosis, we have children who, by the time they're old enough and ready enough to have a go at making the bark canoe, will have already seen it done so many times. They might have had an opportunity to ask questions. They might have had an opportunity to have a go at various bits and pieces themselves, that they've already achieved a certain level of proficiency before they actually have a go. And this is where we find an interesting phenomenon with some Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students, and I must stress not all, this is not a universal thing, because we also see this in non-Indigenous students as well, is this reluctance to attempt something until they've already gained confidence in their own mastery of it. And that's something that I've noticed across different cultural contexts, especially with secondary students.
Yeah, nice. Which is awesome because we've got worked examples for all of the stuff that we put in that book. Thinking specifically about the work that you've done on that, was it the 7 and the 9 book that you worked on? And
I've only worked at the 7 on the 7 book thus far.
So what do you think your knowledge and your expertise makes the Indigenous material in Good Humanities 7 different from other texts that you might have seen around the shops?
Well, I think the idea that I'm working very hard to help the publishers have an opportunity to begin to decolonize their texts, to break away from the fairly standard. We've seen a few changes in, say, the last 10 years or so, but very much a lot of the content has basically been cut and pasted from older textbooks with very little adjustments to the content. And what we know is from the revisions to history that have happened over the past 15 years is that that is no longer true. It's no longer accurate. It's not actually the true facts. And of course, there's the caveat here that history is always going to have some level of subjectivity to it. But what we're seeing through the revisioning process of history is a significant change and a consciousness of how the past is constructed, which can have a direct impact on the outcomes of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students and non-Indigenous students in a contemporary setting. So the things that we've done really hard, that I've worked really hard, is to really focus on the types of language that's being used and the particular vocabulary. We already mentioned the idea of hunter-gatherers and nomads, and what we know is that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people practiced agriculture and aquaculture in ways that were highly sustainable to avoid undue impact on the land. Beyond that, they also engaged with, they weren't nomadic, because to be a nomad implies an aimless wandering. You get grey hair, you put your caravan on, you drive in one direction, and there you go. But what we know is that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, for the most part, Torres Strait Islanders were gardeners. We know that. They would sit on the island, they'd get a lot of their food from the ocean, but they would have gardens that would produce the vegetables and everything else. For mainland Australians, what we know is that there was seasonal migration. So there were stories and knowledge that was held in country or in the stars or in the landscape that would inform them when it was time to move to another area to allow the land in that place to regenerate. We also know there's a site in the Western Districts down there, the coast in Victoria, called Budge Bim, which recently got World Heritage listing. And that particular site had people living there sedentary for 9 months of the year. And the only time those people would move from that area was during the eel spawning season, because the Budge Bim is a huge aquaculture site. Lots of eel farms, lots of channels, eel traps, all that sort of stuff. And they'd move away for the 3 months because that's when the eels were spawning. And there was an understanding that if you remove eels from the water while they're spawning, that becomes unsustainable because you're going to take the parents and they're not going to be able to reproduce for next year's stock. And that was all done with purpose and with intent, and after tens of thousands of years of scientific understanding that informed those practices. Beyond that, the focus has been having a particular section to focus on Torres Strait Islander people, because often in previous editions, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures just kind of get shoved in together. And so it's a matter of making that visible and identifying how that is different and unique, and showing that the respect. And also engaging with the language around how Aboriginal people are positioned. So we're not curiosities or curios. We're not wretched people who deserve pity. What we are proud people who are the oldest living culture in the world, who want to share our culture with you so that you can better understand us, and we can actually have some really fundamentally important reconciliation, and we can move forward together, and we can start having those really hard conversations that we're going to need in the next few decades.
Well said. It would be remiss of me to not ask you a question that is big in current events at the moment. From having taught Year 10 history a few times, the Australian curriculum tries to draw this parallel between the struggle for civil rights for African Americans and how that's been quite influential on the struggle for civil and land rights for Indigenous Australians. So I guess my question is, nationwide protests about Indigenous lives and Black Lives Matter, Indigenous deaths in custody, all which came, the impetus was a murder in the US. And then we had all kinds of public statements. We've got Scott Morrison saying there was no slavery in Australia. So I guess my question
Obviously, he read one of the old textbooks.
Yes, that's right. I know. I actually had a conversation with a person in my staff room who parroted that same thing. I was like, I'll print out a picture of some Indigenous people with neck chains and put it in your pigeonhole. So my question is, firstly, why do you think it took, I guess, we've got this cultural hegemon, the USA, and, it's this incredibly overanalyzed society. Why do you think it took that for it to become a big public issue in Australia again? And do you have hope for the future in this space?
Look, that's a really great question, and I think before I became a school teacher, I worked for 8 years in the print media industry, and the media are a huge factor in continuing the neo-colonial project, which is the current nation state of Australia. Now, their number one priority is to either invisibilize or demonize Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people wherever they possibly can. Now, what this means is that when it comes to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander issues and affairs in this country, they're often positioned in a very negative light, in a very much of a deficit paradigm. So when Aboriginal people are incarcerated, well, that's their fault because they're the ones that have committed the crime because they're predisposed to that sort of stuff. But beyond that, when there's good news stories and whatnot, they tend to get buried. They don't tend to get the airplay because they are not seen as being valuable. And to do so would legitimise Aboriginal people, and then being legitimised leads to awkward questions around land rights and general civil rights and all those sorts of things.
You're so right about the negative portrayal in the media. I'm teaching Year 12 sociology at the moment, and the first unit is Australian Indigenous culture, and we just did a really quick off-the-cuff Google search. I typed in, just because I'd noticed this, I typed in the word Indigenous and clicked on the news, and almost every single news article was justice related.
Yes, entirely. I mean, we have mainstream newspapers in Australia that published racist cartoons up until only a few years ago, and that's because the cartoonist passed away. We've had, in the last 2 weeks, we had the Black Lives Matter rally in Melbourne, where we had 10,000 people come together and everybody had gloves and masks and hand sanitizer and all that sort of stuff. And there's been absolutely no evidence of any community transmission at that event. Yet there are still media outlets that are trying really hard to link the event to the latest spike in COVID-19 cases. And Sky News, I probably shouldn't say the name because, it's terrible, but they actually ran an article which talked about the spike in COVID-19 cases, and the picture they used for the article was the Black Lives Matter rally, even though in the text of the article, there was not one single mention of that as a cause for it. So what they're trying to do is trying really hard to create this distorted understanding of Indigenous affairs in this country. Now, this is where it's really important to consider, as you rightly said, that the cultural hegemony between the US and Australia is that when there's a very high profile case in the US of an African American or a Black American being killed by police, it gets headlines, and there's this almost tangible relief that everybody goes, we're not America, it's so much better here, we don't have to deal with this sort of stuff. And the Black Lives Matters rallies are essentially a reaction to that, saying, well, actually, this stuff does happen here. It happens here all the time, but it doesn't get any media coverage. We had the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody over 25 years ago. And since that Royal Commission, we've had over 430 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander prisoners or people in custody die through various means. And this is not something that gets publicised or engaged with in any great way, much to the dismay of community, because it doesn't have to be like this. So what we're seeing here is a manifestation of the media in this country seeking to both demonise and make invisible Aboriginal issues. So essentially we have to import them, and then we have to have a conversation when what we should actually be doing is addressing them immediately. Any advice I'd say to school teachers in this space, because I know it is quite a current event and something that many schools are having conversations about, is do your research, go online, find the names of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who've been killed in custody, speak their names, honour their memories, and teach your children about what's happening, because it is continuing to happen. And whilst we avoid these hard conversations, nothing is going to change.
Very well said. Al, I could speak to you for hours on this and probably any other conversation topic. I find you fascinating and so full of wisdom and intelligence. I do have one last question. My 5-year-old daughter, Stella, hi Stella, is really, really interested in Indigenous culture. She's been watching a lot of stuff about Play School, and she sees it a lot at her kindergarten that she was at last year. A question from her that she's been asking me and her mother recently is, why do Indigenous, now obviously this is a myth that is brought up in the year 12 sociology class. Not all Indigenous people live in extremely remote areas, but her question was, for those that do live in extremely remote areas, why do they enjoy living in those areas so much? Question without notice from a 5-year-old.
I always love 5-year-old questions. I think often they're very, very insightful. And I think that it's a beautiful little question, because this is where we get to start to explore some of the fundamental differences between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people when it comes to how we think and feel about land. So in a non-Indigenous context, and this is probably an answer that's going to go beyond a 5-year-old, so I'm assuming you're going to be able to sort of simplify the language here for her so she gets it. But for non-Indigenous people, land is something that has been used to stratify society. So in the Middle East, in the Fertile Crescent, back in the Neolithic period, what we started to see was populations that were becoming urbanized and sedentary. And so power and wealth was dictated by who owned the land. So it became a commodity that could be bought and sold. At the same time, in the Australian continent, there wasn't that same experience and interpretation and commodification of land. Instead, the science and the spirituality of Aboriginal people have created an understanding that we don't own the land doesn't own us, or we both own the land and are owned by the land, which means we have a symbiotic relationship where one cannot be adequately separated from the other. And so as we feel connected to people, we feel connected to country as well. And that connection to country is both through our living experience, but also the living experiences of our ancestors and the spirits who inhabit country, and of course our descendants and those yet to come. And so because we have such a connection to country, such a love of country, such a respect of country, this is why we choose, where possible, to live on our ancestral lands, because that is what we use to help center ourselves within our wider environment. Land is where our knowledge is held, it's where our food comes from, it's where our medicine comes from, it's our libraries, it's our history archives, it's a whole range of different things. So we have very much a holistic relationship with country. And so to separate ourselves from country, for many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, especially those in remote communities, creates a really severe homesickness, to the point where, you know, some people will get very sick until they get the chance to go home. And I think that this is a really lovely question, especially given what happened just before the start of Reconciliation Week, where Rio Tinto blew up the gorge that had the two sites that were 46,000 years old.
Where were the 50 police officers who were guarding the Captain Cook statue at that point?
Exactly.
Yes.
And the one thing I'll say to your daughter, when she's thinking about how we relate to country, is that when these sorts of things happen, when these gorges are blown up and when sacred sites are destroyed, scars are being placed on country. But our connection to country means that it's we as people are the ones who bleed. And that is something that I'd sort of like to leave you with as a thought to consider.
Al, thank you so much for our discussion today. I've learned a lot being in the presence of someone so wise, and I hope to see you at the yarning circle that's been built at my school in the very near future. So thanks heaps, Al.
Definitely. No, my absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for the questions. It was lovely yarning up with you.